I would like to welcome you all to our 14th Annual Senior College Symposium. The committee is delighted to tell you that we sold out totally, and we look so forward to our 6 wonderful speakers today. Before that, however, I will ask Harold Atwood, who is our principal, to open this exciting day.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. Well, I'd like to welcome all you. Senior College is pleased to see you all here. This is our 14th annual symposium, and I note that the very first symposium was held on April 11th, 2006, the same day, 3 years before the founding of Senior College. And you can read about this in Peter Russell's book entitled The Rowlett Story, which is the history of retiree organizations at the University of Toronto. One of the speakers at the first symposium was Mary Joy Kellner, who's here today. The symposium is the ancient root that sprouted to produce Senior College, and we try to remain true to our heritage. Today's symposium on thinking and feeling, how do they interact, addresses aspects of human behavior that should concern us all, since the future of our planet now depends on human behavior. The concept and organization of today's symposium is the work of our symposium committee, led by co-chairs Margaret Eichler and Suzanne Heedy, together with Vice Principal Daphne Moorer, and supported by members of the committee, Peter Russell, Mary Joy Kellner, Scott Rogers, Cornelia Baines, Larry Bourne, Carl Barr, Sandy Gregor, Deanne Bogdan, and Linda Hutchin. We're fortunate also in having the dedicated support of our administrator, Venice Crosdale. We owe all of them a vote of thanks for their unceasing advice and their tireless efforts in mustering today's speakers and organizing the program. So join me in a round of thanks. We also acknowledge the support from our sponsors. The Bank of Montreal has supported the symposium for several years now, and this support has allowed us to offer a more inclusive and expansive program. Secondly, we thank Del Manor for supporting the travel costs of an out-of-town speaker. Del Manor runs retirement communities throughout the area. Is Kelly James here today? She is, yes, there she is. She's the representative from Del Manor. And so if you have questions, she's here to answer them. And there are also brochures at the registration desk. We're also pleased to have the participation of students from the University in the Community program. This is a free educational program designed to eliminate barriers to higher education. Each semester, 35 students from diverse backgrounds attend weekly classes taught by experts, often from Senior College, and engage in lively discussions. The University in the Community table is sponsored this year by Professor Donald Gillies and his wife Eve. We're certainly very grateful for that support. Now it's time to set sail, so I'll turn the tiller over to Daphne Moorer.
Okay, without any ado, because a summary of his credentials are in the program right in front of you, let's start off with Keith Oatley. His title is right up there on the screen.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, here we go. So what is an emotion? This was a title of a paper by William James, who is thought of as the father of American psychology. And he thought that an emotion was an inner perception of our muscles and our insides, and it was an end state. But then, in the only large piece of research he ever did, he changed his mind and said emotion is very, very important. But nobody seemed to know that, and many people continued to think that emotion is a kind of end state. And then in 1938, B.F. Skinner was thought of as the founder of behaviorism. And as you can see, those people couldn't even spell right. So our best understandings of emotion nowadays are cognitive. And what cognitive means is it's about knowledge, conscious and unconscious knowledge, and how it's organized and used in the sort of thing that you and I are doing now, understanding stuff. Now, if you want to be, a little bit nasty to someone, you can say that he or she is being emotional. But that's not a very good way of thinking about it. And Catherine Lutz, who was a psychological anthropologist, went to stay on a tiny little island in the Pacific, and the people there actually had a better idea, and they had a word called nunawan, which means thinking and feeling. So a woman there said, I have a lot of nunawan when I look over the sea, and she talked about her son who might be adopted on a different island. So the central term now in research on emotions is appraisal, and that was introduced by Magda Arnold. And probably the most important theoretical person in the psychology of emotions is Nico Freider, who died about 3 years ago. And he said that what happens is when something occurs that affects an inner concern. And so an emotion is a kind of urge that gives priority over other things. And now what we really understand is emotions are at the very center of psychology. So they're not, as the behaviorists say, to be exiled. So the Nobel Prize winner, Herbert Simon, said any intelligent being needs to understand the world, but any understanding can never be complete. It can only be partial. And when there are other intelligent beings, they can do stuff that we can't predict. And so events happen that aren't as expected. And emotions then are necessary to manage these junctures. And they prompt one in ways that are better than just thinking or just acting randomly. And these promptings in us derive from the recurrence of certain kinds of events that have occurred to our forebears during evolution. And so when we're doing something and it's working okay, then we feel happy. And what that does is it prompts us to continue. And I'm sort of happy now, so I'm going to continue. And if there's a danger, then we avoid or resist or try to escape. So how have we found out about emotions? Probably one of the most important ways is by means of what are called emotion diaries. So we ask a person to look out for an emotion. And the first person to do a piece of research on this was Georgina Gates. And in 1926, she published a paper in which she'd asked 51 women to keep an emotion diary of episodes of anger that they experienced. And these women found that on average, feeling angry occurred nearly 3 times a week, and they usually arose from someone preventing them from doing something that they wanted to do. So, in fact, the most important study of anger was by James Averill, and he followed up Gates's idea and asked 120 people to look out for an occasion when they were angry, and another 80 people to look out for an episode when someone was angry with them. And he found that episodes of anger happen when with whom we are close and people we like. And for the most part, what anger does, it allows us to renegotiate something in a relationship where we feel that something has gone wrong. And it enables us then to change something about that relationship. So here's another important person, Marion Milner. And she, at the same time that Georgina Gates did her study, published a study under the pen name of Joanna Field called A Life of One's Own. And she thought what she would do is to keep a diary of occasions that made her feel happy. And it took much, much longer. It took years for her to do this. She thought it would just take a few days. But it took a long time. And what she found is that her life wasn't so much about what she needed to do to be happy, but it was driven by little inner anxieties on the edge of consciousness. And as a result of this, she changed her profession. So she was an industrial psychologist, and in England she became a famous psychoanalyst. So here's a study that I did with Elaine Duncan, who is a PhD student with me, and we asked people to look out for any kinds of emotions, and these were employed people. And as you can see here, anger appears quite often. People feel happy quite often. Sometimes they feel sad. Sometimes they feel afraid. If you do this with students, then anxiety is much higher. But anyway, that's the kind of result we get. And what we found is that about 6% of episodes of happiness, sadness, anger, fear, occurred when people just didn't know what had started them. So about 6%. And that's, of course, what emotion-affecting drugs do. They actually can change an emotion for no reason that we know. About 31% of episodes, there were 2 or more emotions happening at the same time. And about 30% of episodes of emotion changed as they went along. So using this kind of diary method, Bernard Rimet found that he asked people to keep a diary of emotions at the end of each day, and emotions that people could remember at the end of each day, they'd actually confided with someone else, so they talked about them to someone else. Now, if you like, you can keep an emotion diary. And actually, it's one of the best established forms of psychological therapy. So if you actually have an emotion, you can write down what happened, who was there, what did you feel, what did you think, and so on. And that has become, in fact, one of the most central ideas in cognitive behavioral therapy. And it can it's also been shown to be useful to improve what's now called emotional intelligence. So a second kind of diary method is called experience sampling. And so using something like a phone, you beep people and you ask them to write down what they're feeling right now, or the emotion they most recently experienced. And using this method, it turns out that the number of emotions, the number of happy emotions we feel is much, much higher. So feeling happy is something we don't always remember. So then there's a third kind of method, which is called event-prompted diaries. And Laroque and I here, right here at the University of Toronto, asked people to say when they made an arrangement with someone else, how many times did they do that? Well, we make about 10 new ones a day explicitly. And then we asked people to look out for something that had gone wrong in this arrangement. And what they tended to feel was angry or disappointed. And then when the other person in this arrangement was also asked to keep a diary, people were quite good at recognizing other people when they felt angry, but not so good at recognizing other people's other emotions. Okay, now, the most important piece of research that has gone on in the 21st century has been by Michael Tomasello, and he's been here a few times to conferences. But here's what he says. What he does is he's compared babies and chimpanzees, and what he's found is that whereas physical things like being able to pull a piece of string to get some food or looking for something that's hidden, babies, 2-year-old children, human children and chimpanzees are about the same. But humans are just much, much better at understanding what other people are doing. And what he has proposed, and I think this is right, is what the human species, what characterizes us, is the ability to cooperate. And it's occurred in two kinds of ways. One of them is making an arrangement to do something. So here we all are, and we've made an arrangement to be here. That kind of thing. And then a second phase has been the construction of cultures and technologies. And every one of these actually requires us to understand other people and their emotions. So the second part of my talk is going to be largely about reading and literature, because that is, I think, a very good way for thinking about the relation of thinking and emotion. And fictional literature, ever since the invention of writing, has been about this relationship, the relationship between feeling and thinking. So right from the epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh loses his friend, right up to post-colonial fiction, it's been of that kind. And it's had very important effects. So the historian Lynn Hunt has shown, I think rather convincingly, that reading fiction, stories about people who live in a different way than you do, has been a very, very important input to the idea of human rights. So 250 years ago, there weren't human rights. So if you got captured in a war, you were a slave, and that was how it all occurred. But when people started reading about people in situations different than their own, we actually then started to have feelings for these other people. And that was one of the most important events in the abolition of slavery. So, what are narratives of emotion in life and stories? So, Jerry Bruner put it like this. So a person who can act in the world has an intention and then acts on this intention, so that sometimes what he called a vicissitude occurs, and the result is an emotion. And so that is what occurs to us in life. That's the way we think about ourselves. And that same structure is the very same structure as is used in newspaper stories, novels, short stories, plays, movies, and nowadays, of course, television series. And so literature's provided then another source alongside emotion diaries. So a very early example by the poet Dante was about his love for a woman called Beatrice. And he writes 31 poems about this, and then in each one he gives sort of a bit of something, a bit like an emotion diary. And he calls it love. But in this whole story, he never says a single word to Beatrice. So we might think that wasn't quite love. It could be projection. So here is a little verse from Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream, when what we see is some juice being dropped into the eye of a person who is sleeping. And this happens to Titania, who's the queen of the fairies. And what this juice does is when you wake up, you fall in love with the person who you first see. So when Titania wakes up, she sees Bottom, the weaver, who's been turned into a donkey. And so what she says to him, I pray thee, gentle mortal, sing again. So what Bottom has just said is, ee-aw, being a donkey. Mine ear is much enamoured by thy note, and thy fair virtue perforce doth move me on the first view to swear I love thee. And so what Shakespeare's suggesting, and I think this is right, is that emotion is a kind of script. So if you're an actor, you have a script of words, and these prompt you how to interact in an emotional relationship with other people in the play. And emotion is the other way round. So it's a script that sets up a certain kind of relationship between you and other people. And like Titania, you find the words to fit. And so here's some examples. So Betty smiles at Anna. Anna feels happy and smiles back and moves towards something cooperative. So if Betty is in tears, Anna feels sad as well and tries sympathetically to help. Or Betty frowns and Anna senses opposition and the two people are angry. Or Betty cries out in alarm and Anna becomes frightened too. All right? So what emotions do is they set up this kind of script. How are we doing for time? Oh, thank goodness. All right. So here's the most important person writing in English, the most important novelist, George Eliot. And what she said is that her writings are a set of experiments in life, an endeavor to see what our thought and emotion may be capable of, what stores of motive, actual or hinted as possible, give promise of a better after which we can strive. So in order to cooperate, this aspect of who we are as humans, we need to understand the other people. And we need to understand these other people's emotions. And so reading fiction of the kind that George Eliot wrote enables us to understand other people better. And so the job of literary writers like George Eliot isn't to tell people what to think or to feel, but to offer suggestions or cues which enable people, as they read, to construct imaginary worlds. And if you look at reading, you say, all right, now, this was the author, this was the reader, what proportion did they contribute? So the author offers about 20%, but we as readers, much more, 80%. And here is the thing. As you experience emotions, as you read or watch a movie, they're not the character's emotions, they are yours in the situation that the character is in. So what we did in our research group right here in Toronto is that we started with this idea that fiction is a kind of imaginary world, which in psychology we call a simulation. And so we looked at what effects reading had on our understanding of other people. And so we had a good measure of the amount of fiction and non-fiction that people read. We have a very good measure of that. And then in order to test how we understand other people, we used a test called the Mind in the Eyes task. And it's a set of 36 pictures. If you go on the web, you can find it and test yourself. And with each of these pictures, you can choose one of 4 words to say, what is this person feeling or thinking? And so I'll give you an example right now. Here is a person, and what do you think? Is she joking, flustered? Is she experiencing desire, or is she convinced? So if you meet someone at a party looking at you like that and you think she's joking, you may be missing something. The correct answer is desire. And women are better at this than men. But what we found is the more fiction you read, the better you become at it. And so reading fiction enables us to understand other people, including people who are not like ourselves. And so it's not just a pastime. It's actually very fundamental. And my colleague, Raymond, who had the idea of using this test, the Mind in the Eyes test, in the way that I just said, he also has done a study of fMRI studies in which he compared which bits of the brain are involved in understanding other people, understanding in a sort of story kind of way or a non-story kind of way, like the test that I've just mentioned, and our ability to comprehend stories. And here's what he found. So these yellow bits here are the bits where understanding other people and being able to understand a story overlap. So there are bits of the brain that do that. And now I'm going to whisper. If you're a psychologist and you want people to believe what you're saying, then you need to show a picture of the brain. You don't need to understand the picture, just show the picture of the brain. And so what we found then in our research group, and this has now been replicated by research groups all over the world, is that the more fiction you read, the more empathetic you become with other people. And so what empathy is about is experiencing within yourself an emotion that mirrors or is in some way similar to the emotion the other person is feeling. And that, of course, enables you both to think, what is this person thinking and feeling about me, and what are we both up to in this relationship? And so what we do when we read is we put aside our own day-to-day concerns. We take on, and concern, remember, is this term that Nico Freider introduced as the center of emotions. We take on concerns of the protagonist or other literary character. And with those concerns, we then enter into this world that we imagine and think, okay. And you sort of think, but you're not quite sure whether you think, or maybe you just feel, and then when you feel, you can think. What's going on here? And what we found is the more practice you have at this kind of understanding, then the better you become at doing this in your day-to-day life. So here is what Marcel Proust said. A real human being, however profoundly we sympathize with him, in large part is perceived through our senses. That's to say, he remains opaque to us, offers a dead weight that our sensibilities cannot lift. If a calamity should strike him, it's only in a small part of the total notion that we have of him that we will be able to be moved by this. The novelist's happy discovery was to have the idea of replacing those parts impenetrable to the soul by an equal quantity of immaterial parts, that is to say, parts which our soul can assimilate. And so the novelist sets loose in us all possible happinesses and all possible unhappinesses, just a few of which we would spend years of our lives coming to know. So I'm just coming to my last slide. Is that okay? And here it is. This is just for any of you who want to know what it's like here on the left to be a writer. And this isn't actually, this is the last bit of À la recherche du temps perdu. And this isn't just from this bit, but I'll read it to you. It comes a little bit earlier. It would even be inexact to say that I thought of those who read it as readers of my book, because they were not, as I saw it, my readers. More exactly, they were readers of themselves. My book being a sort of magnifying glass by which I could give them the means to read within themselves. Fin. Merci.
Suzanne, aren't you running around with a mic? Thank you, Keith, for that great introduction to the day, and for staying in time.
Yes, no, I was quite good on the time.
And the content.
Oh, thank you.
We have, so you have left 15 minutes for discussion as we had hoped.
You say that reading fiction induces empathy. What evidence do you have that it works that way as opposed to people who are more empathetic enjoy reading fiction more?
Sorry, say that again.
You said that reading fiction causes people to be empathetic. Okay. But what would it not be the case that people who are naturally empathetic would enjoy reading fiction more?
Okay. Very good. Are you a psychologist? Well, that is the very next question that we asked. And so it turns out that we can control for that. We measure people's empathy before they do this, and then we have a way of subtracting that out. And it turns out that it is the other way round. And then a second way of doing it is to do experiments in which people just randomly assign people to read either a piece of fiction or a piece of non-fiction, and it does go in that other direction. So it's the amount of reading you do, that amount of reading fiction you do, that enables people to become more empathetic. Now, you said causes people. That isn't really quite the right way. Okay, so if you've got a piece of bread and you put it into a toaster, then the toaster causes that bread to become toast. But reading isn't like that. What it does is, for people who are interested in it, interested in other people and themselves, it enables them. And so that's the direction. And there's now been a lot of research that shows that that is the direction. So, but thank you. That is absolutely the right question to ask.
Could you talk about the effect of reading nonfiction?
Well, you see, if you read... No, I will. If you read about astronomy, you actually get better at thinking about stars and planets. What fiction is about is what we are all up to with each other. And so really, this difference is really about what the subject matter is. And so, there's lots of non-fiction kinds of things, biography, certain kinds of history, memoir, and so on. And that would be connected with fiction. It's just when we started this, we just made that simple distinction. But you're absolutely right. See, another very good question. All these people here are psychologists.
This one's not.
Why do some readers return again and again to the same works of fiction?
Yes.
And the same may be said of moving image presentations, film, or recordings of television and the like.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. And it isn't reading. It is, and we don't really have a very good word for it, but it's something like engaging in this, what you're saying, in this kind of subject matter. And there's now been experiments to show that it works with movies, it works with television series, and it even works with some kinds of video games where people are asked to think that what they're doing is creating a kind of story. And if you compare them with people who are asked to pay attention to the technical aspects of the game, then they actually improve their understanding as well, their understanding of other people.
Stand up.
Great talk, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
I wanted to know, I'd be very interested in your view of why it is that women seem to be better at judging others than men are.
Yes. Well, I think it's like this. Women are the fundamental members of our species. It's sort of a little bit like cars. Some people just sort of buy a car, and then others want somehow to buy a car and then sort of upgrade it, make it go a bit faster, make it look a bit shinier, And that's what's happened biologically for men. So men are, 15% taller, and probably a little bit better at thinking about mechanical kinds of things in the world. Whereas what the evidence suggests is that women are actually better at thinking about other people. And that's, that I think is actually more central. But, these differences are not huge, but they do exist, or, they have been found.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Very, very interesting. What was occurring to me as you were speaking was I wonder what happens to people who live for extended periods of time in situations of conflict, either a war or maybe an abusive household, where they're constantly experiencing fears and anxieties, and how does that impact their emotional development or their ability to relate to others?
No, well, it has terrible effects. There's been quite a bit of research on that. So if you grow up, as you say, in a war zone, or you're a refugee, then it's actually very, very difficult to recover from that. And another thing that then has been found is that when people are going through, large emotionally based changes, when they've had losses or they've, looked at these terrible kinds of things, then they tend to read books about those kinds of things in order, I think, to understand them better. And then, as Proust was saying, that enables them perhaps to understand themselves better and to move on. I don't know any research, I'm afraid, that relates reading to people who've survived in war zones. I'm sorry, I don't know of any research that directly relates to that. But there is research, as I say, if you've had a loss, then you tend to read about people who've had other losses. If you're worried about getting Alzheimer's, then you read about that and so on.
Hi. Does your research or others' research shed any light on the ability to exert any control over emotions as a result of, for example, reading more or understanding better? Have you been able to measure any kind of...
Yes, sorry, I've got my hearing aids in my pocket here, but I forgot to put them in. So if...
Reading help you control your emotions?
That's the basic question.
Okay.
Does anything help you control your emotions?
Yes, I think... Okay, so the term for this in research is called emotion regulation. Okay, and here's the thing. As I mentioned, often we experience emotions not just one at a time, but several at a time. So let's say it's your birthday, and you go into this room and you didn't know, and it's a party and people sing happy birthday to you. And one of the feelings is, well, if it's me, I just feel totally embarrassed. But I better not do that because these are my friends. And so I move to a different kind of emotion and I say, oh, well, thank you. So one of the things then that we can do is not just focus on a single emotion, but this idea of emotion regulation means that we can actually move among our emotions, and because emotions can take priority, then we can choose which kind of emotion we want to give priority to now. So rather than just being driven by emotions, there's an element of choice there. Does that help answer your question?
Very, very good. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right. Okay.
Okay. Hear how you would relate judgment of people to empathy.
Yes.
I have a sense that if you judge people, if someone came in and you introduced me to Muhammad Ali, a terrorist, I would be judging, and my judgment might make it difficult for me to really listen to him.
Yes.
And have empathy.
Yes. No, that's a very interesting question. So I've just, in fact, refereed an article submitted to a journal about that idea. And what the authors of this article were saying, or they did, is they measured the amount of empathy for people who were offenders, right? They'd been arrested, right? And so, and then they, as well as empathy for these people, they measured the kinds of questions that they would ask these people. And some people, some of the participants had just read a story before doing this test about people behaving in this kind of way, and other people had read a different, read something else, something factual. People who'd read the story didn't feel more empathetic to people who behaved badly, but they asked more empathetic questions of them, as if they would encourage people in a different kind of way rather than just going at them. So I recommended this article to be published.
Yeah. So I wanted to understand the connection between the mechanism that you described of why emotion is helpful to the self, because it enables you to bridge the junctures and various things. How that works, though, in terms of self-awareness of the emotions that are going on, because although we may have that functionality going on, there is a distinction between people who are aware perhaps of their their reactions and those that aren't. So my question was, in terms of is self-awareness, so that ability to understand that you're angry, you're afraid, you're therefore reacting in a certain way, is that necessary for empathy, in other words, for that transfer that literature provides to occur?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. In a second line of research, so that first line of research that we did, I told you about, so people who read more fiction enables them to become more understanding of others. In a second kind of research we've done, we've looked to see whether reading what is called literary fiction enables people, in the way that you say, to understand themselves and change within themselves. So this is research that Maya Djikic and I have done. In our first study, we had people read Chekhov's story, The Lady with the Little Dog, and we compared that with a kind of factual account which had all the same kind of information. It was the same length, the same level of reading difficulty, and people, here's the most important thing, people found this sort of factual kind of account just as interesting, but the people who read the Chekhov story changed their personality by a little bit, but everyone in their own way, not all in the same direction, as happens with persuasion, but everyone in their own way. And so what we think is what you're suggesting, that reading fiction actually does enable us to become more aware of ourselves, and in that way also to be able to change ourselves. And we've followed that up with other kinds of studies. So that's really literary fiction rather than what one might call genre fiction. So, all right, here we go.
Hi.
Okay. Hello?
I'm curious about the impact of isolation on emotions. Has there been studies that you can point to of children who have been locked up for many years or prisoners in isolation? And would you venture to guess whether reading might have been a variable in
Yes.
gaining empathy or becoming human, even though they didn't have contact with other people?
Well, there have now been studies of children, and the more reading or engaging with stories they do, then the better becomes their IQ, their social skills, and what psychologists call theory of mind, which is understanding others. I don't know of a study based on isolation in the way that you say, but now, there's a gathering body of evidence about how reading's important to children. And just this last year, I got invited to go to Mexico, where there is a movement there run by the Ministry of Culture called reading rooms, where these are little rooms in villages where people just go and there are books in there and they sit and discuss them with each other. And one of the things that is important is parents going with children to these places. And so there are people, all around the place, rather than being isolated, who actually are going and interacting with each other via this process of reading. But I mean, that's a very good question, and I don't have the sort of proper answer you want, but these are sort of little hints in that direction. Hello.
And speaking of fiction, like Dante's Inferno,
Yes.
when you read it and then you do the historical study on it, and you find out basically he's putting people that he didn't like in different positions of hell.
Yes.
And then you get a book like the Bible, which I consider fiction, and I don't mean to offend anybody. What do you think people get out from that as far as emotions go?
Yes, well, I think that's a very interesting question as well, you see. And you think about Dante and what he was up to. So here I've had a few thoughts. So in the Inferno, these aren't actually people. The translation from the Italian is something like souls or shadows. And so when I read that, I think, oh my goodness, that's a little bit like literary characters. And so what's happened is these people have acted in the world in ways that have hurt other people, and they somehow didn't know about that. And so, as Virgil and Dante go down through the layers of hell, they meet these other people who in their actions in the world have been damaging to other people, and you think, oh goodness. And that's what Dante thinks as well. And he meets the father of his best friend, who's there, who sits up, in this sort of casket with flames. And this is perhaps one of the most important incidents in the history of European literature. And rather than this person saying, oh my goodness, I'm burning up here and it's horrible, what he wants to know from Dante is whether his son's okay. And so I think what Dante's doing here, you see, is it's not really about retribution. It's actually about, my sense is, when we act, it has effects on other people and we're not always aware of them. Something a bit like that.
Okay, last question.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, this is Sue from University of Community. I'm a fiction writer and I have a mom of 2 boys. Actually, I'm reading fictions with my boys. It's a research for me because I can ask them, what do you feel? And it's a therapy for my boys because they can put their feet in the other characters' shoes. So the thing is, my mom acts as natural and her psychology is better than me. And my question is, in this modern life, in this modern world, we are becoming keen on psychology and we are keen on emotions, but depression and polarization is getting higher. So why we are getting much more depression when we are aware of our emotions?
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry, I should have put my, can somebody just...
I think the question is, we are getting much more aware of emotions, but at present there is much more depression. And how can we explain the rise in depression?
Sorry?
Is that correct? Depression.
Depression.
Depressed.
Okay, let me repeat. getting to know more compared with the last generation. If you're a young mom now, there is more depression that you have to cope with.
Yes. No. Well, I think that is right. I think there's, I think a lot of people, after they've just had a child, they do get depressed. Their whole life changes. And that is a known phenomenon. And I think one of the interesting things about depression is it's a kind of invitation to work through what it is that's happened to you and think through also about what to do next. So I have done a study on depression. I mean, not with young women who've had babies. But what happens is that as you start to make plans, if you're depressed, you don't really have very good plans, but as you start to make new plans, then that actually enables you to work through that kind of depression.
Please join me in thanking Keith for an excellent presentation and discussion.